My pleasure, and for me it's an honor to introduce Bob. I'm from Joplin, Missouri.
Good morning, family. I'm an addict. My name's Bob. I am really surprised that there are this many addicts that want to come hear somebody share about grief. I'm real good at gratitude. Lay gratitude in front of me, and I can handle that one real well. Joy and recovery, I can do that one real well. Even traditions, I can do well. Grief is something that's new to me. So many of you have come up, and I know that there are some who don't know. This is a continuing saga of Bob. Last year, on this very day of the World Convention, while I was sharing my recovery with my beloved brothers and sisters in Narcotics Anonymous, my wife passed away. My wife of 30 years. And it was something that I cannot, you had to be there in order to know what was going on, because it happened. And it happened just at the time that I was sharing. And it happened right at the time that I was sharing about my beloved wife, Nancy. You see, Nancy and I would have celebrated 30 years of marriage to each other on that weekend. We did this thing when I came into NA that was to celebrate our wedding anniversary, and what a better place to celebrate one's wedding anniversary than at a World Convention of Narcotics Anonymous. Our wedding date was the 5th of September. And so we had this thing down through the years. I came in 1979, and we went together as husband and wife, as friends, as lovers, to each of the World Conventions of Narcotics Anonymous since that time. And Nancy's very sick last year. She had cancer. She had lung cancer. And I started not to go, because we put Nancy into the hospital about 2 or 3 days prior to the convention, and she was noticeably weaker. And I went to her and I said to her, Nancy, I don't think that I maybe ought to go to this one in Orlando. I think maybe I'll stay home. And she looked at me and she grabbed my hand and she says, don't you do that. She said, you go to that meeting of Narcotics Anonymous and you give them all a hug for me. And so right as I was sharing about what Nancy had said, I later found out when I got back to the motel room that she had died. And so I cut short my Orlando thing. I had guilt about not being at her bedside for quite some time when she died. As much as I had tried to prepare myself for that happening, it was catastrophic in my life. And it started right when I got the diagnosis 2 years earlier. And we did everything. Talk about powerlessness and surrender. The diagnosis was there was nothing that could be done. The diagnosis was, well, we'll do a little chemotherapy, we'll do a little radiation as necessary in order to try to relieve the symptoms. And we don't know how long it's going to be, but it's not curative. And at that point in time when I heard that diagnosis, the only thing I could do was to scream and to cry and to be angry with the God of my understanding. And I went to Narcotics Anonymous meetings 2 and 3 times a day, and I was on the phone with a lot of members, and my babies in Narcotics Anonymous grouped around me and gave me this. I don't know how normal people get through these things, to be honest with you. I cannot imagine, I suppose if they have church folks, why they come out and gather around, or good friends even out there. But in here, they're special good friends, you know. And I went to meetings and I cried and I was angry, and I don't know if the rest of you have tried this sort of thing in your active addiction, but it's something like non-acceptance. You know, it's kind of like, by God, it's going to be different, and I'm going to find a way to make it different. And I chased around, and poor old Nancy was just okay with it. She worked the program in her life. And, you know, we held each other quite often. And we cried. And we grieved. And that's where the process started. I would never wish anybody the pain and the suffering that was Nancy's to go through. But within that time frame of those 2 years, I want to tell you that when we finally got to that acceptance point, we made a deal with each other that we were going to live as much as we could. We were going to pack in a lifetime into as much time as we had. And we did. Depending on how she felt, we went places and did things. We took a trip to the West Coast. We spent a lot of time dreaming our dreams and holding each other. And the grief process began to go on. And it was something that I grew from. And we went through some things that might be of interest to addicts. Nancy got real sick from the radiation and from the chemotherapy. And we had to have a nurse come and into our home and stay there like 20, live in. And during that period of time, while this nurse was there, we had meetings in Nar-Anon going on all the time, because Nancy was bedridden, and Nancy was a member of Nar-Anon, and her Nar-Anon friends came in. And, my home is open, and people come to visit, my pigeons, and people, friends in the program. We were daily in this most wonderful sharing of the steps and the principles of Narcotics Anonymous. And this nurse, I could see she was listening. And she began sitting in on Nar-Anon meetings. And she began, and I wondered about her. I began checking Nancy had to have medication, pain medication. She was suffering. And I began checking the morphine pills. One morning I got up and I came down, and Georgie was her name, was in bed asleep, and she didn't wake up. And I punched her and I rolled her over and I shook her. I knew inside that this woman had taken an overdose of morphine. And I went and I looked at the pills. And sure enough, this woman had taken 30 or 40 hits of morphine. And there she was dying on the bed in my house with the NA going on all the time. And she didn't make it, And come to find out, didn't know this until after she died and we buried her. It was traumatic. Come to find out, this woman had been a registered nurse in the state of California and had lost her license for taking patients' medication. And just shows to go you that this fucking disease is everywhere, It's just everywhere. And it's all pervasive. And I'm sorry she didn't make it. I'm sorry she didn't say, okay, I want what you have. But she didn't. The grieving process, we packed as much time as we could in the 2 years, and I'm really happy that we got a chance to spend that much time together. We were deeply in love with each other. She was magnificently supportive of my recovery in Narcotics Anonymous. Everything that we did together had extra meaning for us. She was one of these spiritual people who went through this thing primarily without suffering, and we'd be talking together in bed and holding each other and sometimes laughing, and she would begin to tell me. She'd say, "Well, now I don't want so and so and so and so in my bed after I'm gone." Oh no, it's hard to talk about shit like that. A wonderful lady was Nancy, and it's one of those God things, and you cannot tell me that it wasn't how it happened, that she happened to die on the very night that I was sharing at a convention of Narcotics Anonymous. When I arrived home, I got in the plane and went home. When I arrived home, the first thing, a group walked in the house. Everywhere, all over the house, were NA members. They were already there. They had coffee made, they had ham and food, and everybody was there with the hugs the minute I walked in that house. Everybody was there for me. And those who have not experienced that in Narcotics Anonymous, let me tell you, it's a wonderful thing. It is the most wonderful thing that you could have happen to you, is walk into a house filled with friends in the fellowship. Friends who hug you and love you and are there for me. And the first thing I did, of course, is I walked up and I upstairs to the medicine chest and I took Nancy's morphine. And I flushed that because it wasn't necessary anymore. And I'd like to share with you one thing about that. I didn't have any flibberty gibbets. This was Nancy's medication, and that was the way it was. Being in the same room with morphine. Nancy at one time had to go on one of these things called infuser pumps. She wore around her, looked like a little tape recorder. And what it did was it pumped liquid morphine intravenously right into the old vein. And I got to wondering, my God, where was I when that... Woo! When the pain got bad, you could push this little button and give yourself a geeze there. I had no problem. I wondered if I would ever get into that morphine, but it didn't happen. And the reason why it didn't happen was because my higher power, who I found in Narcotics Anonymous, was there with me. And I knew that would have to be the first thing that I would do, because it was no longer necessary to have that morphine sitting around. There was a sense of relief when I flushed that down the toilet, but it was a sense... I suppose you could say that death comes in two ways. Sudden death is a shocker, when it comes as a welcome relief from the pain, it is no less sad for me. And I've had friends die both ways. Sometimes the sudden sort of, it's an emotional amputation is what it is. It's a sort of a wrenching apart. And sometimes the sudden may be better, because my feelings kind of go on to overdrive, and I just kind of wait until, and then I deal with them a little bit at a time. With Nancy, it was the grieving process lasted for a period of 2 years, and I thought to myself, when I went to the funeral, and I cried, and I grieved, and I buried my wife. And I thought to myself, well, this grieving process has gone on now for 2 years. I probably will get over it sooner than most. Wrong. It was okay for a period of about a month, 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I was busy. Attending to funeral, family, friends, all of that was going on. Had a lot of busy things to do. As a matter of fact, I got so busy, I found myself one day when I got up at 5:30 in the morning to go to work, and I got home at 11 o'clock at night, having worked all day long, to walk into that empty house and lay down in that empty bed. And I got to thinking, this isn't quite right. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And what I was doing was I was running from the feeling. I was running from the hurt. I was running from the grief and trying to get rid of it in busy work. I was a speed freak when I was using part of the time, and I know about busy work. When I was early on in my speed addiction, I was able to work 14, 16 hours a day and all the time and just kind of going like that. And I recognized that, see, when I got clean in Narcotics Anonymous, they said, well, my sponsor says, well, why don't you go to work and put in 8 or 10 hours a day and then come home and be a father and a husband and go to your meetings and be a good member of Narcotics. You don't need to work 16 hours a day. That's compulsive work. And so I made a promise with myself, and that was I was not going to work on weekends. I was not going to work at nights. My work was my work. And I found myself trying again to lose those feelings of abandonment, of loneliness, if you want to call it lonely. Many of you who have experienced loss and who know grief know that it is incredibly lonely. This business, I didn't even want to come home. I didn't want to come home. I have a big house. My kids are grown and they're gone. Got nobody to share it with. And I'd come home and I'd go upstairs and after a meeting, and I'd watch television, and some strange things went on in the grief process. I'd reach over in the bed to pat the place where Nancy used to lie, and she wasn't there. And I began to wonder whether I was going kind of nuts, because see, I knew intellectually that she was gone. Had a hard time with that. Had a hard time with reaching over to touch and reaching into empty bed space. And I began to experience shutdown. I began to say, this is not good. I don't like these feelings, and therefore I'm not going to have them. I began to repress those feelings. And about that time, I need to share with you that there were two other things that had gone on with me in the past couple of years. My sponsor, a man by the name of Blackie, that took me by the hand, and everybody's got one. This guy was devoted to program all the way, and he showed me how to live. Take my will in my life and show me how to live. Well, God sent me Blackie. Blackie had died maybe 6 or 8 months earlier of cancer. Blackie had gone through the same illness, and I was big and I was brave and I was one of his pallbearers, and yeah, I cried at the funeral, but I didn't think that had affected me. Began thinking about Blackie a lot. I began looking around for another sponsor, and I was having a hard time trying to find a sponsor to replace Blackie, because I thought, by golly, he ought to be the same kind of I was looking for somebody to fill Blackie's shoes, is what I was looking for. That was not to be. And I finally came to realize, you see, there's nobody that can fill Blackie's shoes, and there's nobody that can fill Nancy's shoes. And there's another fellow who died in March that we used to use together. We were close using buddies. And when it came his time to come into this fellowship, he came to me, and I 12-stepped him. And we were good friends in recovery. And this last March, he died, also of cancer. And his was rather short. And so I had my sponsor a little bit ahead of Nancy. Then I had Nancy out of my life, and then I had Danny Joe this last March. And I just couldn't take any more losses like that. And I clammed up, and I froze up, and I did everything that you told me to do. I worked steps, I went to meetings, and nothing was happening. I couldn't cry. I couldn't grieve. I couldn't get it out. Little by little, it started coming out. And it started coming out angry. It started coming out hopeless. It started coming out, why am I here, sort of a thing. And God loved Narcotics Anonymous because you all kept putting your arm around me and hugging me and telling me it's going to be all right, And I needed to hear that, and you were always there for me. I love Narcotics Anonymous. Narcotics Anonymous, the program of Narcotics Anonymous is my life. And you all put your arms around me and pat me on the back and tell me it's going to be all right. And I'm in terrific pain. And I finally got a sponsor, and he says, I think maybe we ought to start taking the steps, and we ought to begin with step 1. Well, when you're the president in NA, you don't, step what? And he talked to me kind of like a Dutch uncle, and he said, well, I think we ought to start at the beginning, don't you, if we're going to have this new sponsor relationship? And I said, but you don't understand. Well, you know the story. When I knelt down with him to do step 3, the sobs, it all came flooding forth. And I kept on going because I knew that was the answer. Grief is one of these things that's new. I haven't experienced it much before now. Nancy and I had a little boy that died as an infant, and I was unable to cry. I stood over the casket as it was being lowered, and I watched it. It was like I was just watching it happen. And I did not cry for about 10 or 15 years later until I came to you in Narcotics Anonymous. And you were the ones who opened. You had whatever it took to reach down deep inside me and pull that out. And I'm so grateful for that because you do know what kind of pain it is to go through that sort of a thing. I began to see that, grief is a cleansing thing. I began to see that the more I cry, somebody told me, said, tears are the rainbow of the soul. And I love that, the old adage about the sundial, the sundial is nothing without the shadow. And that's true. How am I going to know the peaks, the mountains, without the valleys? You all have given me indescribable joy. And see, when I came in here, you said, keep coming back, it gets better. And what I thought you meant was, you keep coming back, and you won't have to go through any pain. I was wrong on that. But I tell you what I could do. I could go through it without getting loaded. Not once in the loneliness, not once in the pain, not once in the anger. And I used to get loaded at people. Getting loaded at people was my thing. I'll show you, by God, I'll just get loaded. Not once did the idea of getting loaded become an option for me. Not once did suicide become an option either. The grieving process takes time. It takes its toll. And I found a young lady who was interested in me, and I said, well, there's nobody that's ever going to fill Nancy's shoes. Again, I was looking for somebody to fill Nancy's shoes, and I'm happy to report to you on the continuing saga of Bob R. that I have a lady in my life today, and we're in love, and life goes on. That's what I'm trying to say, And before I came down here to Portland, I went out and I made a trip to the cemetery. And I sat there and I meditated and I prayed. And I got in touch with Nancy's love for the program of Narcotics Anonymous. And I got in touch with my own love for the people in the fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous. And if there's anything that I want to share with you today about that, it is that here is the place. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is the real thing here. This is where it happens in Narcotics Anonymous. I love you all very much, and I hope that you'll share and participate and help me as I go through the grief. I'm feeling much better about it now. Once I was able to get my feelings unstuck, once I was able to start working the steps of Narcotics Anonymous again. It'd been a little while since I'd done that. And it'd been like 3 years since I did a 4-step. And boy, the pen just flew right off the paper this time. Sometimes it just comes right. I remember times when I've tried to do a 4-step that I've sat down and I put the paper right in front of me and the pen and I prayed and I got down and lay it on me, God. Put something on the paper there. Nothing happened. Boy, this time when I got to step 4, I just went like that. And the steps work. The steps are where it's at in Narcotics Anonymous. And I can't practice the steps in isolation. I can only practice the steps with other people. So I want to tell you all that I love you and that I'm really grateful for you all having me here to share again today.